this autonomous zone, I want you to give $10 to one African American person from this autonomous zone. And if you find that's difficult, if you find it's hard for you to give $10 to people of color, to black people especially, you have to think really critically about in the future, are you going to actually give up power and land and capital when you have it? If you have a hard time giving up $10, you got to think about, are you really down with this struggle?
Stand here, we repent for our greed, Lord, our greed that we have put our necks, put our hands on these upon the necks of our African American.
And that made me on the hunt for some things that I actually have known through the years because I pay attention. And the first one that I ran across, and I'm just right here, I'm on Wikipedia. Canadian Indian Residential School System was a network for boarding schools for Indigenous children. The network was funded by the Canadian government and Department of Indian Affairs, administered by the Christian churches. The school system was created for the purpose of removing Indigenous children from their influence of their own culture. This was, the phrase was to kill the Indian in the child. And over the course of the system, more than 100 years, 30% of the Indigenous children, around 150,000, were placed in these residential schools. I would say that number was much higher from what everybody here, or at least in Alberta, either knows somebody who was one parent was one of these children or know the people themselves, because this went on until 1960. I saw a documentary back in the 80s when they made their first apology and gave them each a little bit of money and tried to appease them. There was a second apology that came in by Justin Trudeau, and I'll talk about that later. The documentary that I saw, they swooped in with a helicopter to where the natives were living still in their natural environment. And anybody who resisted, they killed, and they abducted the children. And then they placed them in the school system. And I want to read another article that I found. Okay, this article is Abducted Children in Canada. Aboriginal residential school survivor says the Queen of England. Okay, this is the brief. It says the facts. The residential school survivor by the name of William Comby was set to testify at a session of the International Tribune into the crimes of the church and state against humanity committed by Elizabeth II and her husband by suddenly had a mysterious death. Okay, I want to read his statement. It says, I am 58 years old. This is written in 2018. And I am a survivor of the Kamloops and Mission Indian Residential School, both ran by the Roman Catholic Church. I suffered terrible torture there at the hands, especially of Brother Murphy, who killed at least 2 children. I witnessed him throwing a child off a 3-story balcony to her death. He put me on a rack and broke some of my bones. Kamloops school basement after I tried to run away. I also saw him and another priest burying a child in the school orchard one night. In October '64, when I was 12 years old, I was an inmate in the Kamloops school, and we were visited by the Queen of England and Prince Philip. I remember it was strange because they came by themselves, no big fanfare or nothing. But I recognized them, and the school principal told us it was the Queen, and we all got to get new clothes and food for the first time in months the day before she arrived. The day the Queen got to her school, I was part of the group of kids that went on a picnic with her and her husband and some of the priests down to the meadow near Dead Man's Creek. I remember it was weird because we all had to bend down and kiss her foot, the white lace boot. After a while, I saw the Queen leave the picnic with 10 children from the school, and those kids never returned. We never heard anything more about them and never met them again, even though when we were older, we were all around. They just vanished. The group that disappeared was 7 boys and 3 girls, in age from 6 to 14 years old. They were all from a small group in class. 2 of the boys were brothers. Their last names were Arnold. I don't remember the other, just an occasional first name, like Cecilia or Edward. What happened was also witnessed by my friend George Alfred, who was 11 years old and at the time a student there too, but he is dead now. And just to add a side note to that, I've heard and I've seen a number of documentaries about this through the years. They were horribly mistreated, these children, and they were often sent out to be prostitutes for the wealthy in the area. And many of them, there was an article, hold on a second. Okay, here is the article. From 80 residential schools, it says in this article, there we go, that there was over 50,000 children that went missing from the school, and they claimed that it was just runaways. So they were asking, why is this not brought up? Why aren't people talking about this? And then it says 50,000 missing children, 31 mass grave sites, and Canadian is preaching human rights. That was 31 dead children that they found at one of these orphanages or these places where they went and took the children. The article goes on, why have no human rights and champions of the angel fighting for these people's rights questioned? What happened to the 10 Indigenous children of the Canadian Kamloops Indian Residential School who went on a picnic on the 10th of October 1964 with the Queen and Prince Philip and did not return? Those 10 join a list of 50,000 other missing children from the 80 Indian residential schools that have been ran by the Canadian government in the United States United Church of Canada. So it looks like more churches are involved than just the Catholic. No, this was known as the Canadian Holocaust. Canada cannot escape or hide from questions that surround the whereabouts of the 150,000 Native children who have been forcibly removed from their homes and kept in church administration residential schools between 1864 and 1984. I'm going to leave a link for all the articles that I'm reading, and I'm only reading part of it, so you can go and look. This was pure slavery. I don't know what else you can call it, an abuse. Unfortunately, time restriction. I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to go back to the orphan trains. The orphan train movement was a welfare program that transported orphans and homeless children from crowded eastern cities of the United States to foster homes located largely in rural areas of the Midwest. The orphan trains operated between 1854 and 1929, relocating about 200,000 orphans, abandoned or homeless children. That is what Wikipedia wants you to know, but when you start going into it, it's a little different. I think that's the reason why they had the show Anne of Green Gables, because she was supposed to be one of these orphans who had lost both of her parents and came to a really loving family, but the truth couldn't be farther. These children were sold into slavery. They weren't just given away, even though the articles say that they were given free. They auctioned off these children to the highest bidder, just like slavery. And these children, most of the time, not always, were not considered part of the family. They were indentured servants, and they usually slept in the barn or anywhere, wherever they could find. They were not properly clothed or fed. They usually had to forage for themselves. And not only were they treated in that fashion, but they were also sold as prostitutes and molested and had children to the people that were supposedly adopting them. This was a form of slavery. even though you want to call it an orphan train, and they tried to make it sound like this was a good thing. It was ran by the Catholic Church, United States and Canada. It was not. Again, it was to take children away from their culture, so they didn't know who they were. Most of these kids do not even know what their real birth names were. Even though it says 200,000 orphans, when you look at all of the different pictures, I believe there was much more. And people don't throw their children away because they don't want to take care of them. They can't afford them. They get them taken away. And just like what happened to the Indigenous, if there was resistance, they just killed them. Last but not least, the Irish slave trade, the forgotten white slaves. So this is an article that was written in 2008. I know this to be true because I am of Irish descent, and this was well known in my family. Okay, so I'm going to read some of this article. Again, I'm going to leave the article for you, but it says, they came as slaves, vast human cargo transport on a tall ship bound for the Americas. They were shipped by the hundreds and thousands and included men, women, and even the youngest of children. Whenever they rebelled or even disobeyed the orders, they were punished in the harshest of ways. Slave owners would hang their human property by the hands and set their hands and feet on fire. They were burned alive, and their heads were placed on spikes in the marketplace as a warning to other captives. But we're not talking about African slavery. King James II and Charlie I also led a continued effort to enslave the Irish. Britain famed Oliver Cromwell furthered this practice by dehumanizing one's next-door neighbors. The Irish slave trade began when 30,000 Irish prisoners were sold as slaves to the New World. King James I proclaimed in 1625 required Irish political prisoners to be sent overseas and sold to English settlers in the West Indies. And by the 1600s, the Irish were the main slaves sold to them. And at the time, 70% of the total population were Irish slaves. Ireland quickly became the biggest source of human livestock for English merchants. The majority of the early slaves of the New World were actually white. In 1641 to 1652, over 500,000 Irish were killed by the English, and 300,000 were sold as slaves. Ireland's population fell from 150 million to 600,000 in one single decade. Families were ripped apart as the British did not allow Irish dads to take their wives and children with them across the Atlantic. This led to a helpless population of homeless women and children. Britain's solution was to auction them off as well. During the 1650s, and over 100,000 Irish children between the ages of 10 and 14 were taken from their parents and sold as slaves to the West Indies, Virginia, and New England. In this decade, 52,000, mostly women and children, were sold to the Barbados and Virginia. Another 30,000 Irish men and women were transported and sold to the highest bidder. And in 1656, Cornwall ordered 2,000 Irish children to be taken to Jamaica and sold as slaves to the English settlers. Many people today will avoid calling the Irish slaves what they truly were, slaves. They came up with terms like indentured servants to describe what occurred to the Irish. However, in most cases from the 17th to the 18th century, Irish slaves were nothing more than human cattle. As an example, African slave trade was just beginning during the same period. It is well recorded that African slaves, not tainted with the strain of the hated Catholic theology, were more expensive to purchase and were often treated far better than their Irish counterparts. African slaves were very expensive during the late 1600s, 50 shillings. Irish slaves came cheap, no more than 5 shillings. If a planter whipped and branded or beat an Irish slave to death, it was never a crime. The death was a monetary setback, but far cheaper than killing a more expensive African slave. The English masters quickly began breeding the Irish women for both their own personal pleasure and for great profit. Children of the slaves were often slaves, which increased the size of the master's workforce. Even if an Irish woman somehow obtained her freedom, her children remained slaves, and she would remain in servitude to be with her children. In time, the English thought it better way to use these women, in many cases girls as young as 12, to increase their market shares. The settlers began to breed the Irish women and girls with the African men to produce slaves with a distinctive complexion. Those new mulatto slaves brought a higher price than the Irish livestock, likewise enabled the settlers to save money rather than purchase new African slaves. This practice of inbreeding Irish females with African men went on for several decades and was so widespread that in 1681 legislation was passed forbidding the practice of mating Irish slave women to African slave men for the purpose of producing slave for sale. In short, it was stopped only because it interfered with the profit of large slave transport companies. England continued to ship tens of thousands of Irish slaves for more than a century. Records state that after 1798 Irish Rebellion, thousands of Irish slaves were sold to both America and Australia and were horribly abused by both African and Irish captives. One British ship was dumped with 1,302 slaves into the Atlantic Ocean so that the crew would have plenty of food to eat. There is little question that the Irish experienced the horrors of slavery as much, and if not more, in the 17th century as the Africans. And it finally ended in 1839. The slave trade ended for both Africans and Irish.